As you know, we have been publishing Monday morning 8 a.m. weekly for the last 7 months in both written and audio format. As we often do, at this time we are pausing this program to think about whether or not it is the best use of our resources, because we do have limited resources, to help our clients and members achieve big results in their lives and careers. Is this the most effective way to achieve the goals for our members? So we're going to be pausing it, and during this pause, we want to see how many members value the program. And what we'll do is, at the end of this pause, once we gather the amount of votes, and that is the number of people within the FC community who took or who will take the 3 steps I will mention, we will use this to help us decide if Monday morning 8 a.m. will continue after this initial pilot phase, and if we do choose to continue it, in which format. Now, as you go through the 3 steps below, if you're an FC insider, please mention it in your reviews. We may, as always, discontinue this program because while it is very popular and very valuable, as members have written to us to say, it may not be the best way for us to use our resources to help our members get the results they want. So what are the 3 steps that you need to follow in the next 7 days? 1, get the Strategy Insights book on Amazon. Now, this Kindle version has been updated, so all of the previous episodes of Monday morning 8 a.m. are now inside the book. So anything you missed, anything you may want to review or go back and suss out some of the details, are now available in this book. If you've purchased the book before, you don't have to purchase it again. You simply need to download the updated version. And of course, if you like the book very much and you place a review on Goodreads, we also appreciate Amazon reviews as well. And if you can do that by the end of June, you will be eligible to 1 month access to the accompanying cost for the book, but you have to write into support at Firms Consulting for that. The second way you can show us that you like Monday morning 8 a.m. and you want us to keep it going is to go to iTunes for the Strategy Skills podcast, where Monday morning 8 a.m. appears, and post a review there. And finally, you can also refer any friends or colleagues to our email updates by sending them to firmsconsulting.com/promo. If they sign up, they receive access to future updates we have, but also sample episodes of our programs. We always take a moment to reflect and review what we're doing and think if it's the best way for us to help our members. So let us know what you think through these reviews, and in a few weeks, we'll let you know how we've decided to move forward on this. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Strategy Skills podcast from Firms Consulting. If you have not been living under a rock for the last few years, you'd know that artificial intelligence, AI, has become the dominant topic. Yes, everyone talks about information management, information technology, everyone talks about digital, but the key tool that everyone is trying to master is how do you compete with artificial intelligence? Much has been written about artificial intelligence. If you go into the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Financial Times, or whatever publication that you consider to be an authority and that you need to read on a daily basis, you would know the letters AI or the words artificial intelligence will come up there somewhere when describing why Microsoft or why Google has been as successful as they have been. But I must say that it's very hard to understand what is AI. Where to start with AI, what to do with AI, what is the blueprint, what is the roadmap. It doesn't exist. At least I've never seen it. So I'm very happy to have Ash Fontana as my guest today, because he's going to be talking about some of the concepts he's developed in terms of how experienced professionals should go about thinking about AI and the tools they should follow and so on to embed it in their organization, but also how someone who has no exposure in AI can start thinking about AI. But I think the most important thing here is that there's very rarely a situation when I find a book that helps me think about things in a new way. And I would recommend that Ash's new book is probably one of the things I would recommend readers go and get a copy of. Because I think that it's going to demystify big parts of AI. It's going to make it something that is not inaccessible, but something you'll understand and something you'll be willing to follow. I certainly enjoyed the conversation. I think he's a great guy. I think he has a very deep understanding of the insights that are required to win in the AI space, and I would recommend people to read a copy of his book. But in general, not just his book, his thinking, his pieces, his interviews in general are quite interesting. So if you have the time and AI is important to you, his book may be a good place to start, but I think generally any conversation with him is going to be helpful. Welcome, Ash.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you. I must say that I don't often have people who are talking about artificial intelligence and AI. You would be the first one I have on the show.
There we go. Well, this is the point. The point is that no one's really developed a good vocabulary or framework around how to think about AI in terms of business strategy, I don't think.
Well, I'll tell you what I've seen, right? I've seen a lot written about AI, as you know. There's a lot of information, a lot of books written about how Microsoft and Amazon and Facebook are using AI. But I don't think anyone has actually broken it down into a step-by-step way to allow the standard business executive to know enough to question his company strategy.
Exactly.
I think you're the first person that ever did that. And actually, I'm going to read out something that you wrote in your recent book, and I want to start the discussion there. Do you mind if I start there?
Please do.
Okay, so I'm going to read this out. This is on page 264 of your book, right? So it says that I think that the biggest commercial opportunity in this AI first century is to create companies that completely automate valuable services to society. However, you don't start by automating the provision of those services. You start by manually providing those services. You don't start by building technology. You start by building understanding. Now, you are the first person who's ever talked about AI who starts by actually talking about understanding the business. So let's start. My first question, using that as a seed, is what is AI? Because there's so many interpretations of this.
Yeah, look, I think of it as just a different form of intelligence. I think of it as, something that can help us expand our understanding of our environment, something that can help us learn more quickly, which I would argue is the definition of intelligence, the rate at which you learn, and something that really augments us in our daily decision making. The point is, it's nothing like our own intelligence, nothing at all. It doesn't think like us, and nor will it. I think the pursuit of something that looks like our own intelligence and is like human intelligence plus is a fairly futile pursuit, really. I think, the way we think is inspiring and informative and maybe gives us ideas about how to develop other forms of intelligence. But just to emulate our own intelligence, one, I just think it's an intractable problem. And two, I don't see sort of the point. Like, we already have our own brains. What we need are other things that can augment that are maybe more reliable or more rational or able to do things more quickly. And that's what AI is today, and I think that's what it'll be in future. A different form of intelligence than the one we have.
Yeah, when I was reading your latest book, on page 12, there's a line that you wrote in, and you mentioned it now, which to me captured everything I needed to know, why I needed to know about AI, and it was, intelligence is defined by how fast you can learn. And I think that's the point here, because when you think about AI, we tend to get caught up in all these fancy things. But at the end of the day, AI is really about teaching businesses how to learn at a faster rate than the limitations of having the smartest people doing it manually, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And all these algorithms and processes you talk about is really about how do we learn faster.
Exactly.
And the point here, and you lay this out quite well, it's about how do you learn from customers, how do you learn from customer interactions to offer them something they want and need. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. It's about learning about your customers or your production process that leads to the thing you produce that sells to customers. It's about learning about that more quickly than you can with your own senses and your own processing capabilities. Because if you can learn more quickly about it, about the reality of it, about how it operates in different conditions, you can react more quickly and improve it more quickly.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question which I think people are asking themselves, but they're too afraid to ask you directly, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Sure.
AI, the way it is presented in the press, it's presented as if it's an absolute solution and it can't be improved. So this is my question to you. When I think of artificial intelligence, I'm thinking of a machine that can think for itself, but we're not there yet, right?
No, we're not there yet.
So when we talk about AI, we're talking about a field that's still evolving. And what you're saying is that this ability to learn faster using machines is something all companies, it's a skill they need to develop if they want to compete effectively. And I think you also mentioned that the 5 largest companies in the world, tech companies and largest companies in the world, are all using a business model built on AI.
Yeah, they are.
Now that was quite profound for me, because if you're going to make a case for AI, that would be it alone. And while we're speaking about this, Apple just announced their results, Google just announced their results, and all blowout results, right?
Yeah. Amazing.
Now, I'm going to switch back into gears of thinking of this from the position of a CEO, right? Let's assume I run a large company in insurance, for example. And I'm told by my chief digital and innovation officers that I need to invest in AI. As a CEO, how do I know I'm doing the right things? How do I know I'm even investing in AI? And the reason I'm asking this is because how does a company know that what they're doing is AI or just looks like AI? Because there's a lot of people that sell things that don't really work.
Yeah. So you've got 2 different questions there. One is about how do I know it's working for me?
Yeah.
And 2 is how do I know it's real? I'll start with the second one. How do you know it's real?
It's a good question, right?
Yeah, well, this is my whole job, right? Yeah. As an investor in these technologies, it's my job to figure out, do they work and are they valuable? So these 2 parts to your question are what I spend all of my days doing.
Good. So I've asked you a good question.
Yeah. On the does it work question. So this is a situation where you're looking to purchase something from someone that's purported to have AI in it.
Yes. Yes.
Really, the best way to figure that out is by using it. It's not by talking to them, talking through it with them. And what I mean by that is figure out, what data this model was trained on, so that you can ask, okay, does this represent the reality of my situation where I'm going to run this model? Is that environment similar to the environment where this model was trained?
Yes.
Secondly, after you've looked at the data for a moment, ask, okay, what data does it need? The training data, that is. What data does this model need to keep performing well? And do I have that data? It could have been a model trained on a set of images to recognize something in a picture, but you might not have that many images that you are able to feed that model very regularly, or that you'll run it over. So there might be a risk that the model might not perform well over time because you don't have ways to update it too regularly. And then finally, it's just about looking to metrics. And this is where it gets to, the first part of your question, which is how do I know the AI is working for me? So look, whether it's something you bought from someone else or something that you built for yourself, you need to sort of figure out, what am I really trying to do here? Am I trying to make a decision a bit ahead of my competitors? Yes. Am I trying to automate something? So automate the recognition of something in an image, like inventory on a shelf in a store, or damage to some property that I observe through security camera footage, or otherwise, or an instrument breaking on a production line. Am I trying to automate the recognition of something? Am I trying to automate the operation of something? Like,
yes.
Run a robot, basically. What are you trying to do? And then what will doing that do for me? So if it's the recognition of something, automating the recognition of something, or the operation of something, it's really probably about saving costs or finding problems before they cost you a lot. So saving costs in the observing or the quality assurance part of your business, or saving yourself from having a mistake, hurt the rest of your business. If it's about decision making and seeing things ahead of time, it's probably about making money. It's probably about, for example, being able to sell more to a certain customer group by predicting well ahead of time that they might need something, and therefore selling to them before a competitor sells it to them. So once you've figured out what you're trying to do, you can also figure out, how is it going to make or save you money? And that's where it just leads to, okay, what should happen and how do I measure that? And the thing about metrics with AI is they're very different from metrics around traditional software or even traditional business metrics, because they have to be very adaptive. So firstly, they're different because they're quite quantitative. You can measure the performance of a model, the accuracy of a model, etc. So one is they're quantitative, but two, they're changing all the time because the model's job, so to speak, is to help you understand reality a little bit better or a little bit further ahead of time. Maybe less resolution, but a bit further ahead of time. And the thing is, reality is always changing. We live in complex environments. And so, you can put some metrics in place around, is this model doing what I want it to do? Is it saving me money? But you also have to figure out over time, is this model actually, why, if it's not doing that, then why? And that's where these metrics around drift related to, is the model drifting from reality, come into play. And there's a whole bunch of ways in which you can measure drift. And so, again, to recap this whole answer, how do you figure out if it's working? Look at the data, figure out if the model was trained on data that represents what your environment looks like. 2, test it, see how accurate it is on your own data. And then with respect to figuring out if it's working for you, whether you bought it from someone else or whether you built it yourself, firstly, it's about figuring out what you want. Do you want to save money, earn money? How does it relate to your bottom line? 2, is it doing that? So is it accurate in what it's doing? Is it accurately or properly automating things? Is it accurately predicting something ahead of time? And 3, if it's not working, why? Is it because it's drifted? And what are some measures of drift? So there's a lot of detail there. I've got a whole chapter in the book about metrics, but that's a starting point or an overview.
Okay, and that gives me a whole host of questions to go into. So let's go into the first one. I want to make sure that everyone understands this.
Sure.
I'm on the Amazon website now, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at a book I purchased, and Amazon is recommending that I should read these other books, right? Mm-hmm. Now, just to make sure that the listeners understand the point you were saying about testing data, if I want to know if Amazon is using AI, I should say, based on the books Amazon is recommending to me, based on my personal preference, does this make sense to me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the starting point. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good. Now, the next thing is interesting. You didn't say this, but I think you are saying it indirectly, and I want to check this. There's no such thing as one AI system that's objectively better than another unless it does the job it's supposed to do well. Let me explain what that means so the listeners can think about that. If I took the code from 2 separate companies and just compared the code, it would not tell me which one was better unless I looked at how the code achieves what the company was trying to achieve. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, because that's an interesting way, because when you're assessing code is just code, right? So what you're saying is that AI code cannot be assessed just by itself. It can only be assessed relative to what it's trying to do.
Yes, exactly. And I think that the other bit of nuance to add to that is, AI models that are, for example, sold to you by someone.
Yes.
They were trained and developed in one environment.
Yes.
A training environment, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, when they start running on your own data, they're going to perform differently. It's a different environment.
Yes.
And, when that company that built those models sells them to more customers, they're going to learn from all of those other customers that may be in your industry, may not be, depending on, the different permissions they've got to train the model on customer data. But the point is, it's going to adapt over time. This is the thing. It's a self-learning system.
Yes.
And as it adapts over time, its performance is going to change. And so it's a much more dynamic consideration. Let's just compare this to just buying a software product, for example. Mm-hmm. If you buy a piece of accounting software, as long as it spits out the calculation quickly enough, then it's doing its job. And that's not going to change in the next 10 years.
Yes.
It's either doing its job or it's not. If you're, if you're buying a product that, or building a product, I should say, that, aims to get people engaging with like a news feed, it's like a news application. If people are clicking on articles today, then it's a success. If people are clicking on articles in a year, it's a success. Like the metric stays the same. With AIs, the metric might get better or worse over time, and understanding why is really important. because that could be an indication of future performance. So I think that's one difference. Like the metric changes a lot. And two, as the system gets better and better, its capabilities increase. You might use it to make a decision today about what books to recommend to people, but maybe you can use the same model or the same recommender system in future to predict what furniture people would buy. Totally different problem, actually. But the model could learn something very generic about customers. Like, it's not really about whether they want to buy this or that book. It's about what time of day is it, or is it rainy outside? And that might be a bigger predictor of whether they'll just buy anything than anything specific to books or the content of books. And so the point is, these models learn things over time that are at like more abstract levels than you originally conceived, and so they can do more over time. And so the way you therefore measure them in terms of their effect on your bottom line changes over time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I want to unpack that because I think that's maybe one of the most crucial parts of your thinking. So let's assume that, let's use Amazon as an example, right? Because everyone knows Amazon. Let's assume Amazon is collecting data from people using their website, right? So Amazon, the guys who designed Amazon's algorithm for AI, they may tell those algorithms to look for 37 pieces of data and look at how people buy and make decisions and recommendations based on that, right? But then over time, as people do things that the designers may not have considered, as the algorithm starts collecting more data points, it may highlight things that are useful to encourage purchases that it only knows later, but the designers didn't ask it to find in the first place. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. It may observe something that you didn't even observe, pattern of clicks or whatever. Taking a step back, when you design these models, often, not always, some models are trained and built in a completely unsupervised way, but you essentially code in some heuristics. I think people buy books based on the genre. And so if they bought a book in genre A, and I'll just recommend them a book in genre A. And I think people also buy books based on the length. People just categorically don't generally want books more than 500 pages or less than 100 pages. And so, just deprioritize those things and only serve up recommendations for books more than 500 or less than 100 pages. If there are 20 other factors saying they will buy the book. Anyway, you code in these ideas that you have based on your learned experience, your heuristics. But over time, the models change and learn their own heuristics based on that, or based on what they observe. And they could observe something that you don't observe, that you've never even thought about. Like, again, people buy more books on rainy days.
Yeah.
All right. I didn't know that. But great. That's great. They buy more books on rainy days. So I'm going to pay for a stream of weather data to feed into my model so that when it can see a rainy day coming up, it can prepare some recommendations and then deliver them on that rainy day.
So I have a follow-up question to this, right? Let's assume the model figures out that people buy books on more books on rainy days, right? Is there a human interface here that looks at the data and says, wow, the model is telling me this? Or is the Amazon example a website set up whereby promotions and ads are run differently on a rainy day? So what is the trigger point to use that new information? Is it built-in, automated?
Very good question. And the answer is, well, both. It just depends on how you architect your system. And so, the state of the art in some fields, like, for example, in language translation or in various areas of computer vision, is to use what's called a mixed initiative system or an actively learned system, which is the model will say, I think this is a thing. I think people buy more on rainy days. I think that this is, an example of a broken tile on a roof of a house that I've observed from an image from the sky. Can you confirm or deny? And it puts it in front of a human, and the human says, yes, that is, or no, that isn't. And then the next time, the model doesn't have to ask the human because it's got better information about whether that thing is present or not. So some models work that way with like mixed initiative, human and machine, actively learning from humans over time. And it's the case that, initially It might ask the human every second time, yes or no, is this right or wrong? Is this a good or bad recommendation? And then eventually it only asks the human every 5th time, and then 10th, and then 100th, and then 1000th time, to the point where it's pretty much autonomous and only puts the very, very far edge cases in front of the human. So that's one type of system, machine learned system, that is in operation today in various fields, and that's the state of the art in some fields where expertise is very much required. Human driven or based heuristics are very much required. However, a lot of systems, and this includes a lot of the recommender systems that you see presenting you stuff on Amazon or news on Facebook, don't have a human involved at all, and they just learn from patterns. Now, where the human can get involved there to influence the direction of learning is by feeding it new data. So, we can just continue with this weather example. You can develop a recommender system to recommend people books on Amazon, and it will just learn over time based on whatever you told it to learn from. So you tell it to learn from, obviously clicks and purchases is like the confirmation that it's working, but you tell it to learn from genre, page length, color of the cover, whatever, and it'll just keep learning. But then if one day you feed it data about weather, it'll go, all right, I'll just start making some correlations based on weather. And so in the first example, the human is training the model, influencing the model by very explicitly labeling whether it's right or wrong.
Yes.
In the latter case, the human is influencing the recommendations the model makes or the predictions the model makes by feeding it new data, but then stepping back and just saying, learn from this, but I'm not going to supervise the way you learn. So both is the answer.
So am I mistaken in thinking that's a lot like training a child?
The what, sorry?
It's a lot like the way you train a child, right? The information you expose a child to, how you tell a child what's right and wrong.
Yeah, I think, in a very simple sense, we do tend to give moral lessons in terms of right and wrong, at least to start. Like, it's wrong to scream at someone and it's right to say thank you. And so, I think we do sort of give binary feedback to children on their actions to help them understand moral rights and wrongs. Now, children learn in very, very amazing ways, and in ways that machines I don't think will ever be able to learn. But that's another discussion, and there's some phenomenal stuff out there written by people like Gary Marcus on that topic. And in fact, we often study in the field of machine learning and artificial intelligence the way children learn to inspire the architecture of these models, as in the way in which they learn. But I think that's a good example. We do teach children in that way sometimes.
So coming back to your work, right, your latest book, I remember reading there was a chapter, a very good chapter actually, on what is data, the different types of data, the differences between data and information and so on. I think that was one of the most interesting things I've read in a very long time. So thank you for writing that particular piece.
You're welcome.
But I want to talk more about, there's almost a piece of conventional wisdom in the space of AI, which says more data is better. But listening to you, it sounds as if it's not about more data, it's about what data you're giving, what is the outcome you want. More is not always better.
Exactly. There's this whole idea out there or this sort of cute phrase that data is the new oil.
Yes.
And it's just completely wrong. And look, I don't blame people for using that term because one, directionally, it's not bad. Like, it is a good idea to collect more data related to the thing you're trying to understand. Whether or not it's usable is a later question. But the thing is, collecting data can be really expensive. So we've got to go to the next level. And look, we're business people here. Like, if we really want to understand how to allocate capital, at the end of the day, everyone's job is a capital allocator, right?
Yes.
Whether you're an entrepreneur, a CEO, an investor, or just a person going through life, you're constantly figuring out, where do I allocate capital, time, money, effort, etc.
Yes.
And so as business people, we have to start having a better conversation, and we have a better conversation with better vocabulary. And that's what this book gives you. because, we don't really understand the competitive advantage that data gives us today, or could give us today, because we don't talk about it in the right way. And so the way we talk about it today is data is the new oil, etc. So what we're really talking about there is just a scale effect, which is the more data we have, the more benefit we get from it. And as you sort of pointed out in your question, that's not necessarily the case. So you have to add another dimension to the conversation, or some more vocabulary to get to the next level of understanding about what value data can give you. So what I add there is, well, it's not just about the data you have, it's about your capabilities to process that data into information.
Yes.
Now, information, so you can have things like labeling data, or shaping data, or segmenting data, or cleaning up data, adding context to data. They're all capabilities you can develop to turn data into information. Now, once you have information, then you can make a better decision. And so, for example, just knowing something is orange or purple doesn't really tell you anything, but knowing it's a cat or a dog tells you more. It's a trivial example, but, data is think of it as like a number or a binary value or whatever. Information is more than that. It's got more context around it. So once you have capabilities to process that data into information, you can then start thinking, okay, what decision can I make with it? And we can make decisions all day long with our own brains, but if we really want to scale our decision making, we have to move it to a computational substrate. And that's where this network effect comes in. And so you can see that now we've really progressed our vocabulary beyond scale effects to talk about capabilities and network effects, so that we eventually learn something and, as you pointed out, get smarter. Intelligence is all about learning faster. This is what I'm talking about, and that gets us beyond the scale effect of just talking about data in terms of scale. You have some scale effect around economies of scale to get data, or critical mass of data, plus capabilities to process that data into information, plus a network effect as you get that information and put it into decision-making models that can run across the network on a computational substrate. And the combination of these three things is a data learning effect. And that is the concept of competitive advantage that I think can take people beyond just thinking about getting more data, and actually help them allocate capital better to all three of those things, to acquiring data, building capabilities, and building machine learning models or otherwise, to develop a different type of competitive advantage that's stronger than any one of those components.
So very interesting. I'm going to unpack that. Before I do that, in your latest book, you talk about the flywheel effect, right? And use Amazon as an example. And I remember in Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, he also talks about the flywheel, but he explains it using business concepts. And then when you explain it using AI, they actually merge. They're talking about the same things.
They are.
And it's very powerful, because if you really think about it, what Amazon is doing, as Jim Collins explains it in a business perspective, is powered by what Amazon is doing from the AI perspective.
Yeah.
It's just a different language to describe what you're describing, whereby you're explaining the mechanics of how it works and why it works the way it does.
Yes, exactly.
And I like that example, but let's go back to that answer you gave, because it's a very good answer, and I liked some of the anecdotes and examples you used in your latest book. But let's start with the data point, right? I want to see if I understand this correctly. If I'm the CEO of some Fortune 500 company, what you're saying is that I need to be careful about just going out there and collecting as much data as possible, because it's expensive and can take a lot of time and slow me down. And I can create some advantage by being careful about what data I need, where I'm going to get it from, and how much of it I need. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a whole set of considerations around figuring out whether data is valuable. And, I've got a lot of checklists in there that go through this, but whether data is valuable is obviously, in a very broad sense, dependent on what you want to use it for. What information do you want to get from that data, and to make what decision, to get what leverage over time? Because making a decision now ahead of someone else means that you could effectively benefit from something before they do.
Yes.
That's temporal leverage, as I put it. So figuring out what data is valuable, of course, depends on what information you want to get from it. But you can really break that down in a much more granular way that allows you to get to the point where you have a checklist that you can use when you're considering whether or not to, for example, purchase data from a data vendor or invest in a data collection effort, whether, in a very simple sense, like pay a lot of people to go out with clipboards and collect data, or run a survey or do something like that. Or buy a whole bunch of sensors, cameras, microphones, whatever, and put them in an environment. When you're making a big capital allocation decision like that, it's often very important to go through a checklist, like what I have, and consider things like, okay, if I collect this data, how quickly is it going to become irrelevant? If it's weather data, it becomes irrelevant the next microsecond, or if it's stock market data, it becomes irrelevant the next millisecond. But if it's data about, the shape of a mountain, it's pretty relevant for probably another 1,000 years. So it just depends, how quickly will it perish and become irrelevant? How fungible is that data? If I collect this data, actually, could I just collect something that is probably as informative, much more cheaply? Is essentially like for like. Is there another data set out there that's like for like, it's cheaper? How much veracity is there around this data? If someone says in a survey that they really like, pillows that are soft rather than hard, and you take that survey a month later, you might get a completely different answer. So you can't really gauge the veracity of someone's response to a survey about very loose preference. But if you ask someone their age, you can verify that. So it's got high veracity. So there's lots of different dimensions of data to consider when you're considering the value of it.
And just to make sure it's clear to the listeners, that also means that the industry you're in can drive the degree of perishability of your data, which is the value of your data. For example, if you are doing something in the music industry where tastes are changing quite frequently, it's much more perishable versus if you're in an industry, for example, that is tracking and cataloging mountain trails, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think the underlying thing here is it's not necessarily the industry, and it's to put some other words to it, it's the reality that you're trying to model.
Okay, that's a good point, yes.
The environment you're trying to model. You're trying to model an environment because with a model of an environment that's accurate, you can run it forward in time, sort of drag the slider along on the x-axis, and then see what that environment's going to look like. And now, of course, it's
because you could be modeling something in mountain trail industry that requires you to collect data quite often, right?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah,
okay, so that's very interesting. I think that's very fascinating. So coming back to the other point you raised, right? Because you made a very interesting point whereby you said that when you have this algorithm or the model for AI, you need to train it with a certain set of data, right?
Yeah.
So does this mean that, let's take an hypothetical company that is doing really well in the Indian market, using AI to model, understand, predict, and generate goodwill by understanding customers' behavior through cell phone purchases, mobile phone purchases. That would mean, if what you're saying is, I understand this correctly, you're saying that if we took that algorithm and sold it to a company in North America, they would need to retrain that algorithm with data for the North American market?
They might. Yeah, they might. It depends what dimensions the original data had. Was the original data really focused on something specific to
India,
the environment in which Indian consumers purchase stuff? Is it based on some sort of payment method, and predicting their propensity to purchase based on what payment methods are available? And maybe those payment methods are not available in the US. So, you can't really just move that model over and run it on US data because they don't use the same payment methods. Maybe it was based on a totally different purchasing environment, an environment where prices are negotiated rather than fixed. So it really depends. If that original model, though, was trained on, basically people's age and income, Maybe it will transfer to US customers, but probably not. It's probably so different that it wouldn't. So yeah, it really depends. People use cell phones differently. If you were basing it on their movement, Americans spend a lot of time in cars, and a lot of people in India do in some cities, but don't in other cities. And so your movement data will be very different. So it depends on what that model was trained on and how it learned over time. If it was the same dimensions of data, it might be predictive, but it might be totally different dimensions of data.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong here, right? I have many clients that are CEOs and senior executives of major companies around the world.
Yeah.
Now, if one of them picked up a newspaper and read the Wall Street Journal, which said that CEO's biggest competitor, which is well versed in AI, is entering their domestic market. Before being scared, they should understand how they are using AI and whether it's going to give them an advantage in the new market. Is that a correct way of thinking about it?
Yeah, for sure. Like just saying someone's using AI doesn't mean much.
Doesn't mean much, right?
They've done a little regression on something and they've improved the efficiency of some system by 2% or 1%. Might mean that. Or it might mean that they have effectively modeled the market and are able to make decisions about purchasing products in that market well ahead of everyone else and save 50% of their costs. It could be really significant. So you just don't know until you dig in.
So, you putting on my strategy hat here and advising all these people, one of the things we would need to look at is that we need to stop thinking of AI as sort of this absolute perfect thing, but as something that has weaknesses and strengths, and we need to understand what those are before we take on these competitors.
Yeah, exactly. It's not necessarily that it's, strong or weak or whatnot. It's just all contextual.
Yes, exactly. It's about what it's trying to achieve.
Exactly. It's AI, just like our own intelligence, has areas in which it's really strong depending on how it learned. If you did a degree in physics, you're going to be really good with numbers. If you did a degree in English, you're going to be really good with words.
Yes.
And so if you're hiring someone to do a lot of statistical analysis, you'll hire someone who's good with numbers and they'll do really well. And it's just like, what are you hiring the AI for? And did you hire the right AI for the job? That's sort of the question we have to ask. Did you hire or build the right AI for the job? And if you did, you can certainly get a lot from it.
So that's a very brilliant point, right?
AI, you won't.
You're making a very brilliant point here, because what you're saying is AI is a tool, and it only matters for what you're using it and whether that's going to unleash value for your business. If you deploy AI to the wrong priority, you're going to suffer.
Yep, exactly.
So as a CEO, if a CEO is, let's take insurance, well, not insurance, let's take banking, for example, and you've got a bank that has a consumer bank, asset management arm, and investment bank and wealth management, right? Those are your four big buckets and business divisions. Yep. If you build the right AI system to find ways to maximize returns from the consumer banking, branch networks, but if you missed the growth in wealth management, and wealth management becomes the next big thing, but you didn't deploy AI there, it doesn't really matter where you've deployed AI. You've put it in the wrong place anyway. Well,
yeah, or it's an and, not an or.
Yes, and yes, okay.
Yeah, it's. I think the question is, if it is an or, if you have a certain amount of money to spend on data acquisition and talent to build models, etc., should you deploy it on the consumer arm or the wealth arm? Well, you can do a couple of little experiments, using a methodology I call lean AI in each area, and then decide where you want to deploy the bulk of your resources. So, for example, you can do a little experiment on the consumer side, such as let's get a small data set and model with a couple of variables to figure out if we put a product in front of people in the banking app, like a loan product, whether or not they'll accept it or not. Let's see if we can predict a really effective way to suggest new products to people in the app. And let's just do a small experiment with 1,000 users and just manually suggest things to them based on some heuristics we have. And if that works really well, all right, let's deploy it there. But let's also do an experiment on the wealth side, which is recommending investment products based on someone's return profile.
Yes.
So the first model is based on behavior and recommending banking products. The second model is based on return profiles and recommending investment products, not banking products. And you can do 2 small experiments and then see, all right, we spent this much, it took this much time, and we generated this much revenue. We sold this much more of a certain credit product, and we sold this much more of a certain investment product. All right, so now where are we going to spend $1 million? We spent 10 grand doing these 2 experiments each. So we spent 20, we got a certain return. Now where are we going to spend $1 million? And that's the question. And the reality is it's probably going to be useful in both if you run a smart experiment. It's just a question of opportunity costs there.
Yes, and limited budget sometimes.
Exactly.
So the idea of a lean AI concept, which you explained very well now, is this something companies are actually doing, or do they go for this big bang AI approach?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in a sense, a lot of people that are doing lean AI don't really call it lean AI. And a lot of people that aren't doing lean AI should probably know about lean AI.
I think so. Let's talk them through it. I think it's one of the most interesting things about your concept of lean AI.
Yeah, so, really the reason I say why a lot of people are probably already doing it is because lean AI is all about starting small and starting with statistics, which is get one data set that you can load up to one computer, so run it on your laptop, and build one model with just a couple of parameters. So basically like a regression. You can do AI in Excel and maybe Excel with a little plugin or something like that. But that's all it is. It's, saying, all right, I think this is predictive of that. Let's try and run a little model, whether it's a regression or something a little bit more advanced, like a gradient boosted tree or a random forest or something like that. Not that difficult. It's essentially a tree of probabilities. And then figuring out, all right, well, that worked. I was able to predict something pretty well. Should I get more data, or should I try a different model? Or should I run the model for longer, like run it over more cycles on my computer? And then maybe I run it over so many cycles, I should probably put it on Amazon's computers so it can run better.
Yes.
So a lot of people are already doing that every day, running regressions in Excel, playing around with different services from Amazon or Google or Microsoft, and just sort of testing things out. And that's what lean AI is all about. However, a lot of people are not doing that. They're basically going away and either buying a product apparently has a whole bunch of AI in it for $1 million, or spinning up this whole AI team, hiring engineers and whatever else, and buying computing infrastructure and different tools to store the models and build the models and play around with the parameters of the models before they even know, what they're optimizing for. True. And in a sense, that's smart, right? I certainly believe that you'll eventually find some pretty powerful uses of AI. So you may as well spin up an operation that can build AIs today if you have the money to do so, because then you'll find those ways in which to use it more quickly, and then you'll be able to scale them more quickly. But in a sense, it's just not necessary to do it that way. And so that's what lean AI is all about. Firstly, it's about figuring out, are you doing analytics or do you need AI? If you need AI, all right, start small, start with statistics, which is often all about organizing your data first, and spending 80% of your time on that, and then 20% of your time running a model. And then, depending on what works, start building AIs. So then maybe move from just doing some statistical analysis to using a more advanced data science method, but still doing a one-off experiment where you're manually fetching data. You're trying to use a data set that's pretty clean, so you don't have to work with it too much. You're just doing it on one machine, one computer. You've got one data pipeline, just a couple of features, and you're just printing a report at the end. And this is not like, a production AI system that's automatically fetching data from different connections to different databases, that involves labeling multiple data sets, that's running on the cloud, has many, many calculations, maybe even different types of chips running those calculations, more powerful chips, is a network of lots of different models rather than one model, and has like an interface you interact with. So that's what lean AI is all about, moving from figuring out whether you're using AI or analytics or need AI or analytics. Secondly, starting with statistics, then progressing to data science. And then once you figure out what's working, figuring out, okay, what data do we really need to take it to the next level? And being careful about that, not just jumping straight into buying data from lots of sources, paying a lot of money to label data, jumping into data that might be a bit sensitive and difficult to manage, building data platforms and data stores, all that sort of stuff. So that's what Lean AI is all about. It's like going up these levels about getting data, training models, testing, getting feedback, showing results, and then finally building an interface, but being very careful about how you progress through those levels.
But I like this concept of Lean AI because I see many advantages here. One is that you're getting your workforce to become comfortable thinking analytically and using simple data sets, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's enormously beneficial. It's like getting children or young adults comfortable just opening up a math textbook.
It is, yeah, exactly.
There can be no disadvantages to doing that.
No, exactly.
2, by doing these simple experiments that could, literally be rolled out and tested in this few days to a week, you get them to get a result which, whether it's positive or negative, it gives them confidence that they have a handle on what's happening.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that makes people want to do more of something when they get some good result. They want to see some victory, right? A quick win, we call it in consulting. So I think that can build momentum. I think the third one is that by allowing them to play with their own data, they also prioritize the areas whereby more deeper investments in AI could take place rather than just investing in everything.
Yeah,
exactly. It's a sorting system. And one of the things we teach in consulting is that if you want to know the problems in a company, you speak to their frontline staff.
Yep.
And what you're doing here is by getting them to use data, you're getting them to prioritize based on fact as opposed to just anecdotal evidence.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But facts about what's working.
Facts about what's working, but also, you've done something I think very few people have done, and I will give you a big dose of credit for this, is that you've made AI a lot scarier than it sounds.
Yes.
And I think even when I used to read about AI, and I actually have a background in mathematics and statistics, because it's never been explained in a business context, but also just in a practical way of how it's done. It's always assumed it's a big computer program, a massive algorithm taking years to build and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's just not the case. I've had the benefit of working with so many AI first companies, and a lot of them didn't start with millions of dollars. I invested the first capital in the company, and they either had got started with far less, and my initial investment was even far less. Some of them didn't start with people with PhDs. A lot of them did, but some didn't.
Yeah.
A lot of them started with people with just some very deep knowledge of an industry and knowing what decisions are important in that industry, how people make decisions, and what data they have available to them when they make that decision. And then thinking, all right, how can I move some of this online, so to speak? So a lot of people didn't start with that. So you don't need a PhD, you don't need millions of dollars, and you don't need some massive computer to get started. You can get started these days on a laptop using free services with just a little bit of knowledge about what you're trying to predict and some basic skills.
And it sounds as if it's not even about the numbers, it's about the culture of the company first. Do we want to use numbers and facts to make decisions? And then the second part, which you raised right at the beginning, is how do we learn as fast as we can? Because it's obviously a human limitation here.
Yes, exactly.
And the faster we learn, obviously more mistakes we can make, the faster we can react. And if we can get that as an automated process where the machine is thinking for itself, we can learn faster, test things faster, and adapt quicker. Right? We can basically evolve faster.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this is a manner of speaking. The more times you learn, the more times you fail, the faster you evolve and the better decisions you make.
Yep, exactly. The quicker you learn, the quicker you can make a decision in which you have confidence.
I like that because too often we think of AI as something that's going to cost us millions and millions, sometimes billions of dollars for some of these companies. If we're talking about Amazon and so on, I mean, those guys have enormous budgets. So switching gears a little bit here, I want to unpack some of the things because I think it's very useful, right?
Yeah.
As a small company with a limited budget, The barrier to using AI is not capital, it's understanding how to do a lean AI initiative. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And is that process you mentioned about, just taking one simple data set, running a simple regression analysis to test for some outcome that you've determined needs this data set, right?
Yep.
Okay, now let's switch gears here and talk a little bit about large companies and how they compete with AI, right? So let's assume there's two companies competing in a closed market, right? So it's just these two companies, and they're both deploying AI. And let's assume, for simplicity, to make this a perfect world, they're both offering wealth management services, they're both targeting the same segment of the population, they have the same product mix and so on, right? What would they do differently with AI to give themselves a competitive advantage?
Well, yeah, it's so specific to the industry, of course.
So let's talk about principles as opposed to going into details.
Right, sure. Yeah, I think the principles are, think about, it's sort of similar to like this early stages of developing a product. Think about either deductively or inductively, what your customers really need, whether or not you can test that, what's the potential market for that, and is the offering to the market really that much better to what is currently available? Is it 10 times better, faster, cheaper, etc.? And so obviously the angles on that with AI are around automation of, again, something that you're trying to perceive or recognize, or a process you're trying to operate, or on one side, or making a decision ahead of time on the other side. And, again, the sort of principles are like, are you offering a way for people to see into the future, or just better understand their current reality?
Yeah, so it sounds as if all those planning tools about having the right hypotheses, asking the right questions, understanding your customers, you need to have those up front, and AI allows you to be better at it as opposed to fixing any deep flaws in your original thinking.
Exactly, yes.
So if your hypotheses are wrong, you pick the wrong segment, AI is not going to paper over those cracks for you, right? It's only going to be good at what you asked it to be good at.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so it's not a fix-all. It's just one tool that you use to give you an advantage, assuming you've done all of the other things as well as you should be doing it.
Yes, exactly. You've got to have an existing business. You've got to have an existing offering. It's just a question of,
learning as fast as possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so let's kind of, get to the wrap-up phase here, right? Let's talk about what are some of the things you want CEOs and business leaders and smaller business to keep in mind as they use AI, because it's it can be intimidating. I think you've done an amazing job actually of making it very easy to understand, and I think anyone listening to this is going to have a deeply felt and newfound appreciation for AI. But what are some of the principles they should keep in mind after they listen to this and start thinking about dipping their toes into it?
Yeah, I think think about how you can really embed this vocabulary of data learning effects in your mind, because it just helps you think through all of these problems and these opportunities as they come up. Secondly, think about how you can get started in the quickest, cheapest, most efficient way possible. And then thirdly, think about how you can change your sort of capital allocation framework, improve it so that you make really smart decisions about where to invest further in AI. And then finally, it's all about making sure that you keep these things in check. Make sure you have a different approach to measurement that more accurately reflects the potential of AI. So I think that they're all things to keep in mind as you work through this.
Before you go, I want to read out something from your last book on page 264, and I just explain it for the readers, because I think there's a big insight here, but I think that people will miss it. It says that starting with a low-margin manual business in order to acquire data is an odd proposition for someone looking to raise venture capital to build a high-margin software business. So people reading this are going to feel a bit confused, because we're talking about high-margin businesses, and you're saying go into a low-margin manual. I think it's because you want people to understand the business and collect the data to feed into the AI to solve a specific problem and get comfortable doing that, right?
Yeah, all I'm trying to say there is, look, it's not as if this stuff's magic and that it'll just work straight out of the box and all of a sudden your business is different overnight. The reality is it starts with what you know, with the process you have and the people you have, and it develops from there. And over time, absolutely, it can automate and generate huge efficiencies in your business. It is one of the most powerful tools we've ever invented. But sometimes that time will be minutes. It can work very quickly, and sometimes it'll take a while. But I say that so that people's expectations are set appropriately, which is there is a bit of manual work up front, and then eventually it automates. Sure, you can pull something out of the box that works automatically from day one, but it probably won't work that well. If you really want to be AI first, and if you really want a company that gets the full advantage of AI, you have to dig in, and you have to use the knowledge you have in combination with the tools available to you, these AI tools available to you to make a difference.
Yes, well said. One thing I would recommend, Ash, is that after having read your work this morning, I hope that you're doing something to get it into high schools as well.
Yeah.
Because I do feel that it really makes AI so easy to understand and so practical.
Yeah.
That it will excite students.
That's really nice to hear. I hope so. I was at a university the other day with some younger students, and I'm going to try and do some talks in high schools because this is the tool they're going to have to use in their work in future.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's an amazing piece of work. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care, Ash. We'll be in touch. And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.